Clearly curry, which the engineers have found and sampled multiple times, but also Texas barbecue. How was the atmosphere across the weekend? The paddock was, I would say, more alive than we were pre-COVID. So back in 2019, it was still a spectacular event. And yet now in 2021, and despite all the measures being taken, I would say the fan base was bigger than ever. There were more and more people in the paddock and it was buzzing. Compared to really the last 12, 18 months where we've been in paddocks at times just ourselves, it was a breath of fresh air to come in and find hundreds of thousands of people celebrating our sport, the sport that we all love, all together. And it was brilliant. It was really, really good. You could hear the crowds sort of cheering when drivers came out, when overtakes happened, when Lewis took the lead of the race, when Verstappen went for the undercut. And that's what these events are about. They're about the emotion and that being shared amongst hundreds of thousands and millions of people on TV. It was brilliant. Why did Valtteri change part of his power unit this weekend, and did it improve his pace? The answer to that question is that we changed the ICE, what most people think of as the engine this weekend, and just that one component, which is why it's a 5-place penalty. And the reason is that we're balancing performance versus reliability to the end of the season. One failure to finish a race, be it because of a chassis or power unit fault, would be catastrophic for the championship. And as a result of that, we are managing that in the best way possible to the end of the year. And in the case of Valtteri, that meant taking one further ICE to make sure we had absolutely the best compromise. As to whether it improved his performance, yes, a small amount, but it's more about the balance across the remainder of the season than one event. So this change, as painful as it was during the Austin Grand Prix, will actually pay dividends across the next few races. Was a one-stop possible? No. Let's move on. Was a one-stop possible? Not on the tyre lives that we had this year, no. And there's a few concepts that allow you to hopefully see that. If we go back to 2019, a year where it wasn't as warm, where we didn't have as much degradation on the tyres, Lewis just about did a one-stop race with a car that was fast. And if you remember the dying stages of the race, he had run out of tyres and struggling relative to Verstappen behind, who was going to overtake him. Now, that was an on-the-limit one-stop. This year, the track was warmer. The track has evolved. It's more aggressive on the tyres. There was a lot more degradation. So even just taking those into account, you can see how a 2 would be the fastest strategy and a 1 just not even possible. And to put it more in context, a 3 would have been a much better strategy than a one-stop here in Austin this year, given what we had on tyre degradation. So long story short, no, a one-stop wasn't on the cards, wasn't possible. Why didn't you stop Lewis early, knowing the power of the undercut? It is always a trade-off between stopping early in terms of the traffic behind you and not running out of tyres before the end of the race. In other words, optimizing your stints. The fastest two-stop race is actually stopping around about 14 or 15. So anything you're doing shorter than that is costing you race time, is making the entire race slower. Now that may not matter as long as you have track position. Stopping where they did on lap 10 is clearly a compromise, but they obviously were very, very quick. On that first stint of the race on the medium tyre, we had Verstappen 7 tenths behind us all stint, and we were degrading quite quickly. What that means is you don't have certainty that the hard tyre will be much different to that, and you're trying to predict forward how that hard tyre will perform. You saw with Verstappen, he ran out of tyres on that second stint, and he ran out of tyres end of race. What they did was, to a certain extent, gamble. They were in second position anyway, so why not take some risks? The reason for us not stopping that early on is twofold. First, we would have come out right on top of Ricciardo, and we would have been compromised through the S's until we got past him, probably on the run down to 10-12, and that would have cost us time. Maybe not enough to not hold on to that lead position, but it would have cost us time. The second is the Red Bull would have then gone very long, as we did. But they have 2 cars, so they didn't have the pressure to then stop. And they were fast on that first stint on medium. And that could have made us into a very compromised position later in the race. So from our perspective, we knew that early stop was good. And we had highlighted that just the lap where Ricciardo pulls out our window, which probably would have been lap 11, would be the right point. But what Red Bull did is take a gamble. They didn't mind if they had to convert to a 3-stop. Ultimately, Verstappen would have finished second anyway, but we did. That would have put us behind Perez. So ultimately, it's a balance between making sure your first stint is long enough that you're not dropping off the tyre curve on stint 2 and stint 3, because a team that can go longer than you will ultimately beat you if they have car pace. Another decision point in the race is whether or not we could have aggressively undercut Red Bull on stint 2 of the race. Verstappen was just over 3 seconds ahead. And the answer to that is it was very marginal, but we'd highlighted that the undercut wouldn't be enough. If we were to stop, they will cover us the next lap, and Lewis will still end up in P2. But now you've lost all tactical options because both cars were on the same stint to the end of the race. So we had decided that our best opportunity was to force them in, or if we can get within 2 seconds, we'll go for the undercut. That didn't happen. Verstappen stopped, and the rest is history. Did we consider using the medium tyre for the last stint of the race? All the way through the race, we're continuously building up tyre models. We have an understanding of how they're all performing to each other, the soft, the medium, the hard, not just from ourselves, but from our competitors as well. What was very clear is the medium was a very poor tyre for us. On that first stint of the race, we were quite slow. I would say probably in the region of over half a second off what we could do on the hard. And that became an easy decision for ourselves. I think it would have been more difficult with other cars, but given our situation and given we know that we were poor on stint 1 of the race, it wasn't an option to fit the medium again. The degradation would have been too high, and Lewis, whilst he would have still caught Verstappen, wouldn't have had the tyres to even have a go at the end. Had Lewis stopped a lap or 2 earlier on the final stint, would he have had the tyres to overtake Verstappen end of race? So answering that question directly, first of all, 1 lap or 2 laps earlier, he still, end of race, would have tyres that allow him to approach Verstappen, but I doubt it would have allowed him to overtake. To explain that in more detail, there's a compromise, clearly. For every lap that you go shorter, end of race, your tyres will be 1 lap younger. And the tyre degrades. Every lap that you put onto a tyre, every time you roll around 5 kilometres, it takes an amount of performance out of that tyre. So 1 lap earlier means at the end of the race, your tyre will be a tenth, maybe a bit more slower than it would have been. And to generate an overtake, you need a bigger and bigger tyre differential between you and the car that you're fighting. One part of that we can control is our degradation and what lap we stop on. The second that we can't is what Verstappen's degradation is and where he falls off the tyre curve. Now, he was predicted to fall off the tyre curve, and he did, but he only did that on the very last lap of the race. Had that happened a lap or 2 earlier, I think you would have seen a different race result. But they managed that last stint very well and dropped the level of management in corners as Lewis got closer to them to make sure they had the tyres remaining for those last few laps. If we had gone a lap or 2 earlier, a few things would have happened. Verstappen would have been closer on pit exit. He's on fresher tyres, so for every lap that he's been going relative to Lewis, he's actually pulling just a little bit of a gap on track. And when Lewis stops, he has to push back into that gap. He has to basically catch back up to Verstappen. And if the gap's too large, let's take it to an exaggerated level, 15 seconds, he'll use all his tyres back up, closing that gap down, and there's nothing left end of race. So that's where the compromise lies. What you want is to find the lap that minimises the gap on exit and maximises the differential, therefore, end of race. And where we stopped was that in terms of the models. It's difficult to really know what would have happened if we stopped a lap earlier or a lap later. But what you're reliant on really for the strategy to work is Verstappen to run out of tyres, and they didn't really do that until it was too late. Why couldn't Valtteri overtake despite having the DRS advantage on cars in front of him? It wasn't unique to Valtteri. You saw this up and down the field. If I take an example of Verstappen and Lewis, stint 1 of the race, Verstappen was 7 tenths behind Lewis all stint, clearly faster, but unable to overtake. Right at the end of the race, Lewis had a tyre advantage for Verstappen, and Verstappen was dropping off the tyre curves, and Lewis couldn't get close enough for overtake. It wasn't unique to Valtteri. It's difficult on circuits, and obviously it becomes more exaggerated on certain circuits relative to others. In Austin, you're getting a lot of tyre overheating. Everyone is. And when you're the car behind, you suffer more from that than the car in front of you. You're sliding around on the tyres, you lose downforce. And the closer you get to the car in front, the more downforce you lose, and therefore the more you slide around the tyres, the more overheating you get. The DRS is clearly a tool that enables us, therefore, to get through a car when you have a large performance differential. But for it to be effective, you have to be within half a second, 6 tenths on corner exit before you open DRS for it to work. And in the case of Valtteri, it was very, very hard to do that. You saw, in fact, at the end of the race, what he did is back off from Sainz, allow his tyres to cool down, and then attacked one more time and did now get the position. And that's why it's very, very difficult for a number of laps to sit there and wait as your tyres are overheating. You've actually got to let them recover and try one more time. Did the team have Texas barbecue whilst you're in Austin? The great thing with Austin is we stay in the city centre, which is about probably half an hour or so from the track. And in the city centre, you have a wealth and breadth of international cuisine and food. Clearly curry, which the engineers have found and sampled multiple times, but also Texas barbecue. We had Texas barbecue on the Tuesday night, which is the night that we arrived in Austin, at a place with a live band. That was particularly good. And we had another Texas barbecue on Saturday. So a couple of times, both different, both very, very good. Thank you very much for your questions. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time after the Mexican Grand Prix.